Mushrooms are a wonderful companion for any vegetable garden. Not only are they producing you another source of food in between all of your vegetables, but they're helping out your plants. So if you didn't know, mushrooms actually have the ability to form symbiotic relationships with your plants. What you would think of as their roots, their mycelium, come down into the soil and they can interact with the roots of your plants. Mushrooms are very good at hunting for nutrients. And what they do is they usually gather those nutrients from the soil, and when they have a symbiotic relationship with a plant, they actually exchange those nutrients to the plant for sugars that the plant is synthesizing via photosynthesis. And so, mushrooms in your garden can actually be a really good nutrition boost for your plants. Now, usually, if you've been around, you know that I'm mostly a vegetable gardener, and when I do these harvest and cook videos, normally I am talking about vegetables and what I do with my harvests. But I am growing mushrooms in my garden, and today I wanted to show you guys my absolute favorite mushroom recipe. It was my grandfather's recipe, and I remember it being served at Thanksgiving almost every year. And it just has that special little nostalgic place in my heart. And now that I have my very own fresh mushrooms, I wanted to share that with you. All right, so first let's talk about harvesting mushrooms. So I grew my mushrooms in a bale of straw. All I did was inoculate the straw with a grain spawn that I bought online. I do have an entire video explaining how I did this. I'm gonna go ahead and link that up here. These are golden oyster mushrooms, and it took them about 2.5 months to colonize the bale of straw before I got my first fruiting. And this is actually my second fruiting on this bale of straw. Now, normally when you're looking at harvesting oyster mushrooms, the advice that you're going to see is to wait until this little edge right here flattens out or even starts to tilt up a little bit. But in this case, where I'm harvesting straight out of the garden from outside, I'm gonna actually harvest a little early. I learned during the first flush that if you leave them outside, the ants will definitely get to them, munch them, make them look unappealing. And I would rather have a smaller mushroom harvest than a damaged and kind of gross looking mushroom harvest. Because you see, for things like oyster mushrooms, the only thing that you are losing if you harvest early is some volume of your harvest. There are a lot of vegetables in the garden like this actually. Things like green beans, peppers, eggplants. Usually you can harvest them early with little to no repercussions aside from the fact that you're just kind of missing out on that sweet spot where it is like optimal volume of harvest to optimal taste. With the oyster mushrooms, they will taste pretty good as soon as they start fruiting. You just won't get as much of them if you harvest them early. And then on the other end of that, if you wait too long, especially for these outdoor ones, you'll probably find them munched, if not by insects, then by some other little critter that comes along and eats them. And they will just eventually wither and get tough, and they're just not going to be very good to eat past a certain point. If you're a first-time mushroom grower, you will realize that mushrooms come up really fast, and it can be really hard to plan your meals around a very sudden mushroom flush. So what you can do is put your mushrooms in the fridge after harvest, and they will stay good for like 1 to 2 weeks at least. Here I have some pink oyster mushrooms that are harvested from an indoor grow bag. Actually, these got harvested for me while I was on vacation, and I wasn't there to enjoy them, right? So I had my friends stick them in the fridge, and they are still just fine for eating. They're maybe not as firm as they might have been fresh, but they're still just fine for eating, and these are 1.5 weeks old, I think, at this point. So my method of harvesting is really just to kind of put my fingers under it, kind of feel where the stalk is, and gently rock and pull it out of the straw. If your bundle of mushrooms comes apart at this point, that's not a problem. It's just not as pretty if you wanted to take a picture with it. But yeah, if you have to pull them off one by one, that's also fine. If you prefer a knife to go ahead and slice it away, that is also fine, but it is not required. My mushrooms, because they're grown in a bale of straw, mostly just have bits of straw on them and also a few bugs. So I pick off the straw as best I can. I'm probably gonna cut some of that off later. And then for the ants, I blow on the mushrooms. I've tried chasing them down, trying to pinch them. I have tried rinsing them, which if you've ever rinsed an oyster mushroom in water, you'll know that it's a very bad idea. They get really soggy. They hold on to the water. And if you're planning to crisp them up in your cooking, then that's probably not very good for your recipe. So the most cleaning you can do with it dry, the better. And so I found that kind of blowing really forcefully on the mushrooms gets the ants off. You might have to try a few times, but it's pretty effective and it doesn't really seem to damage the mushrooms at all. All right, and that's really all there is to it. You go ahead and bring them indoors. Like I said, if you need to store them at all, put them in a sealed container in the fridge and get them out to cook whenever you are ready. Now let's move on to this actual delicious recipe that I want to share with you. So this is actually my grandfather's wild rice mushroom soup recipe. And first thing I'm gonna do is go ahead and clean up these mushrooms. I got to these ones kind of early, so there's not a lot of cleaning to be done. I am going to leave them in chunks, not too big of chunks. I kind of like smaller chunks of mushroom in my food, but if you like big meaty bites of mushroom, then leave them bigger. As you're chopping your mushrooms, I do want to mention that you can use all the way down the stalk of the mushroom until it gets tough. Right here, it is just barely getting tough, and because I'm putting this into a soup, I can easily just allow that to soften up in the soup. But really, the only limiting factor as to how far down you eat is what you're comfortable with. Mushrooms are all mycelium. The fruiting body is made of mycelium. The root-like things that go through the ground are mycelium. So all of it is the same amount of edible, but it's just about the texture that you would prefer. So the other thing I want to mention is if you have kind of a ratty looking one, maybe it's gotten a little wilted or something chewed on it, or it's just like been handled a lot and it's getting kind of rough around the edges, that is still perfectly fine to eat. It's really just an aesthetics thing. If the texture of it bothers you, then don't use it, but it is perfectly safe to eat. So you can either do this concurrently while you are chopping mushrooms if you feel confident in your timing abilities, or you can wait till after. Then you can start your rice. So I have a long grain wild rice here, and I also have a black rice. This is very expensive. This is expensive, but slightly less expensive. And I really like the aesthetic of the black rice. So I usually mix these about half and half when I'm doing this, just to kind of cut down on the cost. You could probably substitute a different kind of rice, but I would recommend having at least some wild rice in there because I think the texture of it is what really makes this soup good. I'm gonna cook my rice in this homemade chicken stock. If you want to make this vegetarian, obviously you can use veggie stock. I'm doing 3 cups of rice, and normally you would cook that in 6 cups of liquid, but I'm going to do 8 cups of liquid because we're making a soup. Alright, the next step is going to be to saute onions and mushrooms in butter. Again, for vegan, you can use olive oil, it's just fine. I am going to use some of my smaller onions from my recent garden harvest, and I am just going to dice them up finely. Okay, so you can saute your onions and mushrooms for as long as you want. If you like them less cooked, that's fine. If you like them crunchy with a little bit of caramelization on the edges, also fine. Whenever they are sauteed to your liking, go ahead and add them to the already simmering rice. So wild rice actually takes a long time to cook. At this stage, if the timing's been about right, you're probably still about 30 minutes out from your rice being ready. I'm trying for about 50 minutes of cooking on my wild rice. Once you're about 15 minutes out from your rice being done, we're gonna go on to the next step where we are going to add our alcohol and our cream. So the recipe calls for 2 ounces of cognac or brandy, and I don't have either, so I'm just going to use whiskey. And then the recipe calls for 2 cups of half and half. I don't have half and half, so I'm going to use cashew milk, which is also the vegan substitute that I would recommend. I think also almond or oat milk would work just as well here. So once you've added your alcohol, which is optional, and your cream of some sort, then we are going to make a roux to help thicken up the soup in its final stages. I'm going to use butter and flour to make my roux, and the exact measurements are kind of hard to come by, but you can see here I'm using about, 1 to 2 tablespoons of butter and a little less than a 1/4 cup of flour. When the roux is done, I'm going to add it into the soup and stir, and then continue to let it simmer for whatever time is left until the rice is done. The consistency of the soup should look something like this when you're done. For me, I prefer it to be a little more stew-like than soup-like, so if you want it to be thinner, then of course you can either use less thickener or you can just leave that out altogether. It really is up to you at this point what you want the consistency to be like. And this is the part where I tell you how absolutely scrumptious it is. Very hot, but very good. So this stuff will keep really well in the fridge for at least a couple of weeks. I've never let it sit around any longer than that. Reheats really well, but it's also a really great big pot meal for a group of people. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I wish you all happy gardening.